15 years ago, this port was struggling with strikes, old equipment, and shrinking traffic. Today, it's pushing over 5 million containers a year, ranking among the top 5 ports in Europe and the busiest in the Mediterranean. This is Piraeus, and it's not just Greece's largest port. It's the main maritime gateway to Athens and one of the closest major European ports to the Suez Canal. From Suez, ships can head northwest toward ports like Rotterdam and Hamburg, which have dominated European trade for decades. Or they can stop much earlier in the Mediterranean. And that's where Piraeus sits. For cargo coming from China, stopping in Greece can cut up to 7 days off the journey compared to going all the way to northern Europe. From Piraeus, containers can move by rail through the Balkans into Central and Eastern Europe, reaching markets that used to rely almost entirely on ports thousands of kilometers away. So when you look at a map, Piraeus doesn't just serve Greece. It sits on the shortest sea route between Asia and Europe, with direct land connections into the EU's interior. That makes it valuable, very valuable. But for most of the 2000s, Piraeus was not acting like a major global hub. The port struggled with outdated infrastructure, slow cargo handling, and constant labor disputes. Container volumes stayed low, shipping lines preferred other ports, and investment barely kept up with basic maintenance. By 2008, Piraeus handled less than 1 million containers per year. That's tiny by global standards. At the same time, Greece was heading straight into the worst economic crisis in its modern history. And that's when China was starting to look very closely at Europe's shipping map, not because Greece was weak, but because the geography was perfect. The timing of those two things colliding is what turned Piraeus into one of the most important ports in China's global trade strategy. But before China arrived, Greece had to reach a point where selling the port felt like the only option left. So what exactly pushed Athens to that point, and how did one of Europe's most strategic ports end up under the control of a Chinese company inside the European Union? By 2009, Greece was in serious trouble. Years of heavy borrowing, weak tax collection, and overspending had pushed public debt to unsustainable levels. When the global financial crisis hit, investors stopped trusting Greek bonds, and the government suddenly couldn't borrow money to pay its own bills. Within months, Greece needed emergency loans just to keep running. Between 2010 and 2018, Greece received over 260 billion euros, or about $300 billion in bailout packages from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. But those loans came with strict conditions. Cut public spending, raise taxes, and sell state-owned assets. This wasn't optional. European creditors wanted Greece to reduce debt fast, and privatization became a central part of that plan. Airports, energy companies, railways, and ports all went on the list. Piraeus, despite its problems, was still one of the most valuable assets the government owned. Selling part of it could bring in immediate cash and reduce the need for even more borrowing. But inside Greece, this plan triggered heavy backlash. Unions warned that foreign buyers would cut jobs and weaken labor protections. Many politicians said the country was selling national infrastructure under pressure, not by choice. And public trust in both the government and European institutions was collapsing. Things got even more complicated in 2015 when the left-wing Syriza party won elections by promising to stop privatizations altogether. The new Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, openly criticized earlier plans to sell the port. Members of his cabinet called the sale unacceptable and argued that Greece should not lose control over such a strategic asset. But then reality hit. Greece still needed bailout money to avoid bankruptcy, and privatization was written directly into the rescue agreements with European lenders. So even the government that ran on stopping sales had to move forward with them. That's the moment when selling Piraeus stopped being a policy choice and became a financial requirement. Now, here's the part that often gets missed. When Greece started offering major assets for sale, there were not many Western companies lining up to buy. European port operators were cautious, banks were nervous, and the crisis made long-term investment look risky. China didn't see it that way. Beijing saw a country desperate for capital, sitting on one of the best port locations in the Mediterranean, at exactly the time China was trying to build faster trade routes into Europe. So when Greece needed buyers, China was ready with cash, ships, and a long-term plan. But China didn't start by buying the whole port. First, it tested the ground, and that happened several years before the full takeover. The real entry point came much earlier, in 2009, right as Greece's debt crisis was starting to unfold. That year, Greece signed a long-term concession agreement with COSCO Shipping, a Chinese state-owned shipping and logistics company. Under the deal, COSCO received the right to operate 2 of the port's main container terminals for 35 years. Greece still owned the port, but China now controlled a big part of daily operations. At the time, this looked like a technical business deal, not a strategic shift. The Greek government wanted immediate investment without giving up full ownership, and COSCO wanted a foothold in the Mediterranean to support its growing shipping network. Both sides thought they were getting a practical solution. For Greece, COSCO promised to bring in modern equipment, improve efficiency, and increase traffic at terminals that had been losing customers. For COSCO, Piraeus offered something extremely rare: a European port where it could operate terminals directly instead of relying on third-party port operators. That matters because shipping companies care a lot about turnaround time. If your ships can unload faster, you save fuel, labor costs, and scheduling delays. So COSCO started investing almost immediately. It installed new cranes, expanded storage areas, and upgraded container handling systems. It also introduced stricter performance targets for workers and managers. This led to tension. Labor unions complained that Chinese management pushed longer shifts and tighter productivity rules. Strikes and protests followed, especially in the early years of the concession. But the numbers told a very different story. Before COSCO arrived, the terminals handled roughly 700,000 containers per year. Within just a few years, volumes multiplied several times over. Shipping lines that had avoided Piraeus began returning. More COSCO vessels started routing through the port. Other Asian carriers followed because faster handling meant lower operating costs. Piraeus was no longer just a local Greek port. It was turning into a serious transshipment hub for the Eastern Mediterranean. By the early 2010s, Piraeus had already jumped into the top ranks of Mediterranean ports, even though China still did not own the port authority itself. And this is where something important happened. COSCO now had proof that the location worked, the investment model worked, and the port could compete with Europe's biggest hubs if it had enough capacity. So when Greece later decided to sell a controlling stake in the entire port authority, COSCO was not taking a blind gamble. It was expanding control over an operation it had already tested and reshaped. In other words, the takeover didn't start with ownership, it started with operations. And by the time the ownership deal arrived, COSCO already had years of experience running the most profitable part of the port. That put China in a very strong position when the privatization tender opened. COSCO was not just another bidder, it was already operating most of the container business. It had invested money, equipment, and staff, and it had a clear plan to expand the port further. In April 2016, Greece's privatization agency accepted COSCO's bid to buy a 67% stake in the Piraeus Port Authority for €368.5 million, or about $427 million. The deal happened in 2 steps. First, COSCO paid about €280 million, or about $325 million for 51% of the port. Then, it agreed to invest another €94 million in infrastructure upgrades over the next few years. After completing those investments, COSCO would receive the remaining 16%, bringing its total ownership to 67%. So this wasn't just a sale for cash, it was a trade. Ownership in exchange for guaranteed development. For Greece, this structure mattered. The government could tell voters that it wasn't simply handing over the port, but securing long-term investment that the state could not afford itself. For COSCO, majority ownership meant full control over strategy, pricing, and future expansion. But politically, the sale was sensitive. The government that approved the deal had previously promised to stop privatizations. Protests broke out again. Dock workers worried about contracts and safety rules. Opposition politicians accused the state of selling national infrastructure under pressure from foreign creditors. Even inside the ruling party, some ministers publicly criticized parts of the agreement, yet the deal moved forward anyway, because Greece still needed bailout money, and privatization remained part of the rescue conditions. Once COSCO took control, management of the entire port authority shifted under Chinese leadership. Investment plans expanded beyond container terminals into cruise facilities, car shipping docks, ship repair yards, and logistics zones. China was not just buying a container port, it was turning Piraeus into a full maritime and logistics complex. And it didn't take long for the results to show up in traffic data. In 2008, the port handled about 700,000 containers. By 2014, that number had already passed 3 million. By 2024, Piraeus was handling roughly 5.4 million containers per year, and all of this happened inside an EU member state, using European trade rules and serving European markets. Which brings us to the bigger picture. To understand why Piraeus matters so much to China, you have to look at how China moves goods across the world. China is the world's largest exporter. Every year, trillions of dollars worth of products leave its factories and head toward consumers in Europe, North America, and beyond. Shipping costs, delivery time, and reliability are not small details. They shape supply chains, pricing, and competitiveness. For decades, most Chinese cargo going to Europe entered through ports in the north, like Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg. From there, it traveled south and east across the continent. China's strategy with Piraeus flipped that pattern. Instead of entering Europe at the top and moving down, cargo now enters at the bottom and moves up. This does two things. It shortens the sea leg of the journey, which reduces fuel costs and shipping time. And it shifts part of Europe's logistics system closer to routes that China can influence more directly. This fits neatly into China's Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to build trade corridors that link Chinese ports, railways, and logistics hubs across continents. Piraeus is the maritime entry point of that corridor into Europe. From there, rail lines connect through the Balkans into Central Europe, tying port operations to inland logistics centers and industrial zones. This is not about replacing northern ports completely. Those ports are still huge and highly efficient, but even shifting a small percentage of traffic matters when you're talking about millions of containers per year. If 10% of China-Europe trade routes through Piraeus instead of Northern Europe, that already changes traffic patterns, investment flows, and competition between ports. That doesn't mean China controls European trade, but it does mean China becomes part of the system that manages it. And from Beijing's point of view, that reduces dependence on foreign-controlled logistics networks. It also spreads China's commercial presence across multiple countries instead of concentrating risk in one region. For China, Piraeus is not an isolated case. Chinese companies now hold stakes in ports in Belgium, Spain, the Netherlands, and Italy. But in most of those places, ownership stays below 50%. Piraeus is different. Here, China holds a clear majority. That makes it the strongest Chinese-controlled port foothold in the European Union, and that's why the project carries far more political weight than its financial size alone would suggest. But the story doesn't work unless Greece also benefits. For Greece, the economic upside has outweighed the political discomfort. So when you look at Piraeus today, you see two stories at the same time. On one side, a port that went from near stagnation to one of Europe's busiest trade hubs. On the other side, a critical European gateway now sits under majority control of a foreign state-owned company, raising long-term questions about influence, security, and political independence. So here's the real question. If China hadn't stepped in, would Europe have invested enough to turn Piraeus into what it is today? Or would this port still be struggling, stuck in the shadow of Northern Europe's giants? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.